Today we have a story about a record found where it was never meant to be read, a quiet testimony preserved by accident and dust rather than intention. It was copied by an unknown hand and marked only with a place, a year, and a warning in the margin that reads, "Keep this sealed. If you enjoyed this story, consider subscribing and becoming part of our community." Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love hearing from our amazing viewers all around the world. The woman named in the record was Grace Holloway, a black washerwoman living on the edge of a small mill town in the American South, during the years when the old century was bending into the new. The town was called Briar Ridge, though there were few briars left and little ridge to speak of. It was a place of dusted roads, fixed routines, and people who learned early not to ask why things were done the way they were. Grace rose before dawn each day. She boiled water behind her boarding room, scrubbed other people's linens until her knuckles split, and walked to the mill chapel on Sundays with her head bowed and her gloves mended again and again. She spoke softly, smiled when spoken to, and carried herself with the careful calm of someone who understood that survival depended on being unnoticed. Her work was owned, in all but name, by Mr. Daniel Crow, the superintendent of the Briar Ridge textile mill. He controlled the mill wages, the boarding houses, and even the chapel keys. He was a man who believed order was proof of righteousness. His voice was never raised. It did not need to be. The boarding house where Grace lived had rules posted in the hallway, written in neat, narrow script. No lights after evening bell. No visitors without permission. No speaking in the halls. The rules changed without notice. Those who asked questions found their wages docked or their rooms reassigned to colder corners of the building. Grace noticed things early. How Mr. Crow always stood too close when giving instructions. How the mill doors were locked from the outside during late shifts. How names vanished from the work ledger without explanation. A woman would be there 1 week, gone the next, her cot stripped clean as if she had never existed. When Grace passed Mr. Crow in the corridor, he would smile without warmth and say her name slowly, as if tasting it. She learned not to look up. The record ends this first entry with a line written darker than the rest, pressed hard into the paper. Order was kept in Briar Ridge, but something beneath it watched, counted, and waited. And Grace Holloway had begun to notice the pattern. The second entry in the record begins without ceremony, as if the writer feared that too much introduction might invite discovery. It notes that the trouble did not arrive loudly. It came in the form of a small correction. Grace Holloway was summoned to the mill office one afternoon just before the evening bell. Mr. Crow sat behind his desk with the ledger open, his fingers resting lightly on the page as if the numbers themselves were delicate creatures that might flee if handled too roughly. He did not ask her to sit. He told her there had been an error. Her wages for the past week, he said, had been miscalculated. Too much had been paid. The amount would be corrected by withholding her next allotment. Grace listened with her hands folded, eyes lowered, and thanked him for bringing it to her attention, though she knew she had been paid no more than usual. When she returned to the boarding house that night, her lamp was gone. The matron told her it had been removed for violating the lighting rule. Grace did not remember lighting it after the bell, but she apologized anyway. She finished her washing work by touch in the dimness, guided by memory and patience. The next morning, her name was spoken aloud in the mill chapel. Mr. Crow addressed the gathered workers and spoke of discipline, of gratitude, of the danger of carelessness. He did not look at Grace, but the pause before continuing made the silence turn toward her like a held breath. Some of the women would not meet her eyes after that. Grace bore it quietly. She continued her work, scrubbed her linens, attended chapel, and kept her voice gentle. But the record notes the change in her posture. She began to count steps. She memorized which doors creaked and which did not. She noticed that Mr. Crow's shadow often lingered just outside her workspace long after he had moved on. One evening, as she returned late from the wash yard, she found her door slightly open. Nothing inside was missing, yet her bed cover had been folded in a different way. The window latch was warm, as though recently touched. She stood there for a long moment before entering. That night, as she lay awake, she heard a sound in the walls. Not footsteps, not rats, something slower, measured, as if someone were counting time itself. The entry ends with a single sentence, written smaller than the rest. It was not fear that settled over her then, but the understanding that she had been noticed, and that noticing was never without consequence. The third entry in the archive is written in a steadier hand, though the ink grows thin in places, as if the writer paused often, listening. After the matter of the wages, the rules in Briar Ridge began to change with unnatural frequency. New notices appeared on the boarding house wall, written in the same narrow script, though the ink was fresher each time. Work hours were extended without announcement. Chapel attendance became mandatory on evenings that had once been free. Silence was required not only in the halls but in the wash yard as well. Grace Holloway followed every rule. She always did, yet correction found her all the same. Mr. Crow remarked upon her posture. He advised her to lower her eyes further. He instructed her to take a longer route between the mill and the boarding house, though it added no safety and only time. When she asked, carefully and politely, why this was required, he smiled and said it was for balance. Whispers began to follow her, not loud enough to challenge, only enough to isolate. A woman named Evelyn Moore, who carted cotton beside Grace, leaned close one afternoon and murmured that Grace's name had been scratched out and rewritten in the ledger twice that week. No reason given, no mark to explain it. Evelyn did not speak again after that. Strange things accumulated. The chapel doors sometimes locked themselves during evening prayers, holding the workers inside until Mr. Crow dismissed them. A side room in the mill, once used for storage, was kept shut at all times now. Grace noticed that when the door opened, even briefly, the air inside felt wrong, stale in a way that had nothing to do with dust. One night, Grace returned to find her trunk moved closer to the door, as if to remind her how easily it could be removed. Beneath it lay a scrap of paper bearing only her initials, written and rewritten until the fibers tore. Still, she endured. It was Mrs. Ruth Calder, the chapel caretaker, who finally acknowledged what was happening. She pressed a folded hymn sheet into Grace's hand and whispered that some rules were older than the town itself. That men like Mr. Crow inherited them along with their authority. That those who broke the pattern were corrected until they learned where they belonged. As Grace lay in bed that night, the counting sound returned in the walls. Slow, patient, unbroken. And for the first time, the record notes, Grace Holloway understood that the town was not merely watching her. It was preparing her. The fourth entry is marked with a thin crack across the page, as though the paper itself had been folded too many times under strain. The breaking point did not arrive as a shout or a blow. It came in the form of a notice pinned to the chapel door, written in Mr. Crow's careful hand. Grace Holloway was to be reassigned. Her washing work would end at week's close. She was ordered to report instead to the night floor of the mill, effective immediately. Everyone knew what the night floor meant. The machines ran longer there. The doors were sealed. Supervision was absolute and unseen. Women returned from that shift changed if they returned at all. Their eyes learned new ways of avoiding light. Grace stood before the notice for a long while. Her reflection stared back at her from the chapel glass, smaller than she remembered. When Mr. Crow appeared beside her, he spoke gently, almost kindly. He said the town required sacrifice. He said obedience was a form of protection. He asked her if she understood. She said yes. That evening she packed her few belongings with careful hands. She folded her gloves, smoothed her dress, and placed her mother's small Bible at the top of her trunk. Her breath remained steady, but her heart beat with a weight she had never known. On her way to the mill, she passed the closed side room. The door stood ajar for the first time in weeks. Inside, she saw shelves of ledgers stacked deep and high, their spines worn thin. Names were written and crossed out, written again. Some pages bore no names at all, only tallies. When she reached the night floor, the doors closed behind her with a sound too final to be mistaken. The machines were already running, their rhythm matching the counting she had heard in the walls. Mr. Crow did not appear. Instead, his voice came from the shadows, instructing her where to stand, how to move, when to stop breathing so loudly. Hours passed without measure. At dawn, she was dismissed without word. Her wages for the shift were not mentioned. Grace walked back to the boarding house under a sky that felt too wide, too empty. She realized then that the threat was not merely to her work or her body, but to her name. To be erased quietly, corrected until nothing remained. The entry ends with a single line, pressed so deeply the paper thinned. In that moment, Grace Holloway understood that survival would require more than obedience, and that silence had already failed her. The fifth entry bears signs of careful concealment. The ink is lighter, the margins crowded, as if the writer feared discovery and wrote only when time allowed. Grace Holloway did not protest her reassignment. She did not cry out, nor did she seek comfort in complaint. Instead, she began to watch with new intent. She listened not as a subject, but as a witness. She learned the rhythms of the night floor. She noted when the doors were locked, and when the overseers changed. She memorized the sound of Mr. Crow's footsteps and the moments when his voice came from hidden places rather than his own mouth. She counted how often names vanished from the spoken roll and how often new rules appeared without record. Grace began to collect fragments. A discarded ledger page slipped into her sleeve while sweeping the side room. A hymn sheet with altered verses that no longer matched the printed book. A boarding house notice that bore 2 dates, one scraped away beneath the ink. Small things, dangerous things. She discovered that Mr. Crow did not invent the rules himself. They were older, passed down from previous superintendents, amended but never erased. A system designed not merely to control labor, but to decide who was allowed to remain visible. Mrs. Ruth Calder became her quiet ally. The older woman never spoke openly, but she left doors unlocked when they should have been sealed. She misplaced chapel keys at useful moments. Once she pressed a bundle of old meeting minutes into Grace's hands and whispered that the town council had approved measures they pretended not to know existed. Mr. Crow sensed the shift. His smile tightened. He corrected Grace more often, watched her longer, stood nearer than before. But he mistook her calm for submission. He believed fear still governed her. What he did not see was the way Grace's hands no longer shook. She learned the language of the rules. She learned how they contradicted one another, how one notice invalidated the last. She learned that the mill's authority depended upon secrecy more than law, upon silence more than truth. Hope crept in quietly, unwelcome and dangerous. It walked beside dread, inseparable from it. On the final page of the entry, the writer notes that Grace hid her gathered fragments beneath the floorboard nearest the window. The same window whose latch had once been warm. The line beneath is written in careful, deliberate strokes. The town believed Grace Holloway was alone. This belief would become its most costly mistake. The 6th entry is written with unusual clarity, as though the danger of silence had finally outweighed the danger of speaking. Grace Holloway chose the moment with care. It came on a Sunday evening when the mill chapel was full, and the air was heavy with heat and expectation. Mr. Crow stood at the lectern, delivering one of his measured addresses on order and gratitude. The doors were closed, as they always were during evening assembly. Grace rose from her bench before fear could speak louder than resolve. Her voice did not carry far, but the room was already silent. She asked respectfully whether the rules governing night labor had been approved by the town council or merely inherited. She asked why wages were corrected without record. She asked why names were removed from the ledger but never returned. Mr. Crow smiled at first. He said these matters were not for public concern. He said discipline required trust. Grace reached into her sleeve. She laid the ledger page upon the chapel table, then the altered hymn sheet. Then the meeting minutes Mrs. Calder had risked everything to save. Each piece bore the same mark, the same narrow hand that wrote the rules and pretended they were law. A murmur passed through the room, not outrage, recognition. Mr. Crow's voice sharpened. He said the documents were stolen. He said Grace misunderstood her place. But his certainty faltered when Mrs. Calder stepped forward and confirmed the ink, the dates, the signatures. The doors were unlocked then by someone unseen. The town clerk, pale and sweating, arrived late, summoned by whispers rather than bells. He read the papers in silence. His hands trembled as he did so. The rules Mr. Crow enforced had never been recorded properly. They existed only in practice, not authority. Power shifted, not in triumph, but in discomfort. Mr. Crow attempted to speak again, but his words tangled. His voice echoed strangely, as if the chapel itself no longer carried it as it once had. The counting sound Grace had long heard in the walls ceased. By morning, the mill was closed for inspection. The side room was unsealed. Ledgers were removed and examined beneath proper light. Grace returned to her room and waited. The entry ends with a simple statement, written without flourish. When the patterns were exposed, the town could no longer pretend it had not seen them. The 7th entry is marked with a different ink, darker and less steady, as if several hands contributed to what followed. The reckoning took place in the town hall, a narrow building that had once served as a courthouse before being reduced to records and meetings of little consequence. On that morning, it filled beyond capacity. The mill stood silent behind it, its machines stilled like restrained breath. Mr. Daniel Crow sat at the front, his posture rigid, his authority suddenly fragile. He was no longer framed by shadows, but by daylight that showed every line of strain in his face. Grace Holloway stood several steps behind him, her hands folded, her expression calm. The clerk read aloud from the ledgers, names, Absences, corrections without cause. Each reading landed like a measured strike. The room listened, not with anger, but with the slow horror of realization. When Mr. Crow was asked to respond, his voice betrayed him. He spoke of tradition, of inherited responsibility, of the necessity of control. His words sounded rehearsed, worn thin by repetition. Grace was invited to speak. She did not accuse, she did not raise her voice. She described her days, her reassignment, the locked doors, the counting that governed the night floor. She named those who vanished. She named the rules as they had been written and rewritten. Her words were plain and precise, impossible to dismiss as hysteria or misunderstanding. As she spoke, a detail emerged that chilled the room. The tally marks in the side room ledgers matched the number of night workers lost over decades. Not wages, not hours, lives measured as adjustments. Mr. Crow denied this, but his denial came too late. The clerk's records confirmed it. The chapel caretaker confirmed it. Even the boarding house matron, trembling, admitted to receiving instructions she had never questioned. The mask fell quietly. Mr. Crow was removed from his post before the meeting ended. He did not resist. His eyes avoided Grace's, not in hatred, but in something closer to fear. The system he had tended was larger than him, but he had been its keeper. As he was led away, the counting sound returned briefly, echoing once through the hall before fading entirely. The entry ends with a line written by a final, unknown hand. When the truth was spoken aloud, the thing beneath Briar Ridge lost its voice. The final entry in the archive is longer than the rest, written as if the keeper of the record feared that without fullness, the truth might thin and fade. After the reckoning, Briar Ridge entered a season of uneasy quiet. The mill reopened under oversight from outside the town, men who asked too many questions and wrote everything down. The night floor was dismantled piece by piece. The side room was emptied, its ledgers carried away in crates that never returned. When the door was finally left open, nothing remained inside but dust and a smell like old paper and breath held too long. Some townsfolk insisted that nothing had truly been wrong, that order had merely been misunderstood. Others spoke less and listened more. The chapel sermons changed. Words like obedience and correction were replaced with restraint and accountability. The bell still rang, but it no longer trapped anyone inside. Grace Holloway did not become a symbol. She refused that shape. She returned to her work, choosing washing and mending because they belonged to her hands, not because they were assigned. She moved to a smaller room by the window, one that faced the morning light. When asked why she stayed in Briar Ridge, she answered that leaving would have allowed the town to forget too easily. The boarding house rules were rewritten, signed, and dated. When someone tried to alter them quietly, the paper was brought into the open and read aloud. That practice endured. The record notes small changes that mattered more than declarations. Wages paid in full, doors that opened from the inside, names spoken clearly and written only once. The counting sound that had lived in walls and floors never returned, though some claimed they still heard it when the wind pressed hard against the mill at night. Those claims were never confirmed. Grace grew older. Her hair silvered. Her hands bore the marks of honest labor. She taught younger women how to read notices, how to question without raising their voices, how to recognize when rules were meant to protect and when they were meant to erase. When she died, there was no grand announcement. The chapel bell rang once, then again, then rested. Her belongings were sorted with care. Beneath a loose board near the window, the papers were found and given to someone who understood their weight. The final line of the archive is written in firm, unadorned script. This account is preserved so that what was done quietly will not be undone quietly again. Grace Holloway lived, endured, and remained. Let the record stand where silence once ruled.